You're listening to an Ono Media podcast. Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the Into the Dark podcast. I'm your host, Peyton Moreland. I'm so glad that you are here today and that you are listening to this episode. Into the Dark is a true crime podcast that every so often also ventures into everything spooky, dark, and mysterious. Before we get into today's Halloween episode, I need to do my 10 seconds. Garrett and I spent the weekend away from home because he was competing in a pickleball tournament, and I decided that I was going to attempt to bring Daisy, our dog, to the tournament because dogs were allowed. It was outdoors. But sometimes when there's that many people around, Daisy will get overstimulated. And so I went to Target and I bought like a wagon and fans and just a whole bunch of stuff to try to make it so it was more comfortable for her. And she did so good. You guys, everyone kept coming up being like, oh, she's so cute. I had her in the wagon with her fans. She just watched the tournament. She just watched people. She didn't bark. She didn't cry. She seriously was so good. I was so impressed. I think her having like a designated space where she felt safe was a really big thing. I think if she had been on the ground, she would have felt really nervous. Granted, she's so small that people will sometimes not see her and get close to her, so that's kind of scary for her. But yeah, either way, it went great. She did so good, and I was so proud of her. So yeah, that was the first time I had taken her to a public place that was kind of just stimulating, where people are coming up and petting her, and it's loud, and she did so well. So I'm so proud of her. That is my 10 seconds for this episode, and let's get right into the case. You know, it seems like everyone loves vampire stories, especially these days. I mean, you just look at the box office, there are a bunch of movies that kind of surround vampires, but there are different approaches to vampire mythology. And you cannot go to the bookstores without finding shelves and shelves of novels about creatures of the night. Some of us like scary stories about evil bloodsuckers. Others like the more romantic takes. And who doesn't love the idea that it's possible to live forever, never get old, and become incredibly strong and powerful? I mean, it makes complete sense that people are into vampires, but it is worth mentioning that sometimes it's possible to like vampires a little too much. What starts as a pop culture fandom can go too far and become an obsession. And it is not healthy to be too fixated on anything, especially something that's potentially not even real. And that may have been the case for a 23-year-old man named Allan Menzies. He had been born and raised in a region of the UK called West Lothian. And that's a part of Scotland, and it's not too far from Edinburgh. Now, by 2002, Allan was between jobs. He usually worked as a security guard, but he just wasn't having any luck in his search for new positions at the time. Of course, he had a lot of free time being unemployed in Scotland, so Allan filled his hours by reading and watching every book, movie, or TV show he could find, especially ones about vampires. He loved these kinds of stories. So anytime Allan heard about a new vampire book, TV show, or film, he just had to find it right away. And in February of that year, a new movie came out called Queen of the Damned. It was a sequel to the 90s film Interview with a Vampire. This follow-up was about a vampire named Akasha. She was the queen of the undead, as you can probably tell from the title. The character was played by a famous R&B singer named Aaliyah. And before it even got released, this feature was already pretty infamous because after Aaliyah finished filming, but before the movie could come out, she actually died in a plane crash. She was only 22 years old. So when Queen of the Damned hit the theaters, a lot of Aaliyah's fans bought tickets so they could watch her last performance and say goodbye. But other than those devoted fans, the film actually didn't do very well. Critics said that it wasn't good. Film buffs and horror fans alike decided to skip the screenings. And at the end of the day, the Queen of the Damned flopped. But it still had a very small cult following. A handful of people who really loved the feature. And that included Allan Menzies. He was obsessed with the movie. Over the course of about 10 months, Allan watched this movie 100 times. This meant countless trips to the theater. And then when it was released on video or DVD, he did buy a copy. And he watched it over and over again. So often that it prevented him from pursuing his hobbies, finding another job, honestly doing anything with his time. In a lot of ways, it seemed like Allan's entire life, now that he couldn't find work, was devoted to vampires and Aaliyah's fictional character. But for the most part, his friends weren't too concerned about this, apparently. They knew that Allan had always been a little odd and that he tended to develop extreme fixations on things. And for the most part, the people who knew Allan thought that these quirks were harmless. They just tried to support him however they could and let him be the person that he wanted to be. And this included Allan's best friend in the entire world, a 21-year-old man named Thomas McKendrick. Now, Thomas had a lot in common with Allan. He was currently unemployed and looking for work in Scotland. And the two men actually lived in the same place. But even though Thomas didn't have a job, he was known for being very responsible, so he wasn't spending his entire time watching vampire movies. He checked in with his family regularly to make sure they were okay. He was good about staying in touch with Allan, his best friend, making sure he was all right, showing up when they had plans. Thomas didn't share Allan's fascination with vampires or with the movie Queen of the Damned, but otherwise, they had a lot of similar hobbies and interests. And more importantly, they just enjoyed each other's company. Thomas knew Allan wasn't very popular and he didn't have an easy time getting to know people. But I want to be clear, this was not a pity friendship just because Allan was a little weird. It was genuine between Allan and Thomas. So, on December 11th, 2002, Thomas was supposed to visit Allan at his home. They didn't have any firm plans beyond that. There was no one else they were going to meet. There was no movie tickets, nothing concrete in mind. They were just going to hang out. The idea was they would maybe talk or watch TV, just kind of have a day at Allan's house together. Now, Thomas and Allan didn't check in with anyone for the rest of the day. So it wasn't clear what they were up to once they started hanging out. But Allan had a weird encounter with Thomas's mother, a woman named Sandra French. And this encounter happened a short while later. It was the same day. Sandra was actually shopping for groceries. And at one point, while shopping, Allan walked up to her and started chatting. This is his best friend's mom. It's a pretty typical interaction. Except Allan asked Sandra for advice. He said, "Hey, can you tell me how to wash blood stains out of clothing?" Now, I know that probably sounds very strange and mysterious, but it's important to remember that Allan had a reputation for just being a little weird, so it actually didn't faze Sandra at all that he was wandering around a grocery store and talking about cleaning blood-splattered clothing. If anything, she might have figured this was just something that came along with his vampire obsession, like fake blood. I don't know. Maybe he was talking about it because he was pretending to be a creature of the night. Who knows? Or maybe he cut himself while performing his chores. The point is, Sandra, Thomas's mother, shared all of the laundry advice she could think of, and then she went back to her grocery shopping. And she didn't give that conversation with Allan a second thought. At least, not until later that day. See, Thomas never came home from Allan's house. Of course, he is an adult, so he's allowed to stay out all night if he wants to. And given that it was 2002, I don't know if Thomas owned a cell phone or if he had any way to reach his mother, Sandra. But since he didn't have a job or any real responsibilities, it wasn't a huge deal if he just stayed out with his friends for a while. So maybe Sandra decided to just give him his space. But then several more days go by and Sandra never sees Thomas. And none of Thomas's friends have seen him either since that last day he was hanging out with Allan. They have no idea where he is. So finally, someone in Thomas's family calls the police to report him missing. And his family told the investigators it was very out of character for him to just take off like this, even though he is an adult. He was responsible and close to his family. He had never done anything like this before. And to make things even stranger, Christmas was coming. The holiday was a big deal to Thomas. Of course, he would want to be involved with all of the planning, the decorating, the shopping for presents, and everything else. Except Christmas came and went without a word from Thomas. And then New Year's passed, and still nobody had heard from Thomas. Nobody had seen him. There was no sign of where he had gone. And I want to know, I'm not sure that everyone knew he had been hanging out with Allan that day because he was an adult. It's not like he was telling everyone what he was doing. So if you're wondering why they aren't like asking Allan a bunch, it's because of that. So the good news is the police took the reports of Thomas's disappearance seriously, and they were doing everything they could to try and find him. They even pulled his bank records to see if there were any clues there. And as soon as they looked at his transaction history, it became clear that the situation was pretty grim. See, Thomas was receiving government assistance, and he got checks in the mail to help him make ends meet while he was looking for a job. But Thomas hadn't cashed any assistance checks since mid-December. He hadn't touched his bank account since the last day he was seen. And he didn't have a ton of money in savings either. I mean, he didn't have any income. The point was, to all appearances, he should have been broke. The investigators knew there was no way Thomas could afford to book a hotel room or buy groceries. If he wasn't at home and he wasn't staying in a hotel, that didn't leave very many possibilities for where he could now be without access to money. So this was very concerning and a sign that he probably didn't disappear willingly. Something might have happened to him. One early theory was that Thomas might have just been in a deadly accident. See, he enjoyed ferreting, which is a special kind of hunting. Basically, if you want to hunt rabbits, it's easy for them to get away by going down their holes, but ferrets can be trained to chase rabbits, catch them, and bring them back to the owner. And they're small enough to follow rabbits into their dens. So Thomas often took his trained ferrets with him out into the woods to hunt for rabbits. And he particularly loved to do this near an old quarry near town. And this is why the police thought maybe he might have just slipped, hit his head, a rock may have fallen on him. He could have been hurt, trapped, or even killed when he was hunting. The officers sent massive teams to search the area top to bottom, but there was no sign of him there or of any of his ferrets. Now, by January 8th, the officers still had no idea what had happened to Thomas. But on that day, they found evidence that just made the entire situation look even worse. Someone found a bag that had been dumped in a public area in town, and the bag was full of clothes. Now, when police compare these clothes to Thomas's, they realize it's his. It appeared to be the same outfit he had been wearing on the day he went missing, although the police needed to gather more information to confirm that. The point was, if Thomas had been in an accident, he wouldn't have taken all of his clothes off, stuffed them in a bag, and dumped it somewhere else. Somebody else must have taken those clothes off and then disposed of the clothing. And his disappearance was no accident. So at this time, the officers made a public statement in which they said they were now treating Thomas's missing persons case as a murder investigation. They put together a huge task force with 20 investigators from multiple departments. And by working together, this team made another big discovery a few weeks later on January 20th. Now, by this point, it had actually been 6 weeks since Thomas had last been seen alive. And the new discovery was again bad news for him. See, a search team found a decomposed body buried in the woods just outside of town. A post-mortem examination showed that these remains were Thomas's. And as the police had suspected the entire time, he had not died of natural causes. Someone had beaten him, stabbed him, and buried him. Now, the next step was for detectives to speak to all of his friends and acquaintances, try to really figure out what happened the last day he was seen alive. They wanted to know if he had been with anyone on the day he had gone missing, or if anyone had motive, or opportunity to abduct and kill him. Well, many of Thomas's friends had spoken to him that day, either in person or on the phone. And he had told them he was going to go visit his friend Andy. Now, that is not Allan. Problem is, none of his other friends know who Andy is. They couldn't tell the police his last name or where he even lived, just that it was one of Thomas's friends. These witnesses also didn't know if Andy had a motive to want to hurt Thomas. Well, it seems the officers spoke to Thomas's mother around then, and they asked her if Thomas did have a friend named Andy that she knew about. And from what I can tell, this question somehow sparked her memory of the strange encounter she'd had with Allan at the grocery store when he was asking about how to wash blood out of his clothes. Now, of course, now that Thomas was missing, this question seemed a lot less innocent than it had to her before. So the officers figured maybe Allan was Andy and he sometimes used a nickname, or maybe Thomas didn't want other people to know his name. Even if he wasn't Andy, Allan is still now an important part of this story in trying to nail down the timeline. He could confirm if Thomas had made it to his house, how long he had been there, when he had left, what he planned to do. So they pulled him into the station for questioning. And while Allan was in the interrogation room, other officers actually went through his house to look for physical evidence. Maybe they were hoping to find a murder weapon, those bloody clothes that he had mentioned, or even something that had once belonged to Thomas. They don't find a smoking gun, but this probably won't surprise you. They find a ton of books about vampires. So as they're searching Allan's house, they're like, wow, this guy has an obsession. And it seemed like Allan had been reading everything he could about vampires. But police don't need a smoking gun, because for Allan himself, he seemed collected when the police were talking to him. He wasn't nervous at all. And he almost immediately blurts out that he had killed Thomas. He was very calm and matter of fact as he gave this confession to murdering his best friend. He sounded equally undisturbed when he explained why he had done it. And I have to tell you, his motives are bizarre. Allan started by admitting to police that he was obsessed with vampires. It was just like what I said before. He loved the movie Queen of the Damned and he'd watched it over 100 times. Except Allan didn't seem to understand that the film was a work of fiction at this point. He believed the main character, the vampire queen, was real. And not only that, but according to his statement, he says that she had been appearing to him late at night when he was alone in his bedroom. He claims she would walk up to his bed and have long conversations with him. And apparently these talks had started out fairly casual. The queen and Allan chit-chatted about whatever popped into their heads. Like, it was no big deal for a vampire queen to just be visiting him at night. But as the time went on, according to him, eventually she said she wanted to turn Allan into a vampire like her. Now, according to Aaliyah's a character, fictional character that's now visiting Allan, she tells him, you can become immortal. There's just one catch. You can't transform into a vampire unless you kill someone and drink their blood. And Allan told the police that with this obsession with vampires, he couldn't resist it. He realized he also needed to become a vampire, and that meant someone around him needed to die. Except at first, Allan didn't want Thomas to be his victim because, according to him, they were best friends. Allan wasn't sure who he should kill, but he certainly didn't want to harm someone he cared about. But then something went very wrong while Thomas was visiting Allan on December 11th. According to Allan, they were sitting and talking, and of course, Allan starts discussing his favorite topic in the world, vampires, and the movie Queen of the Damned. Except Thomas kind of made a dismissive comment. He said, I don't like the movie. I don't even care about this vampire queen. I'm not sure of the exact words he used, but apparently he went on to insult the character in the film. And this sent Allan, who this is now his sole reason for existing, it sent him into an irrational rage. After all, in his mind, the queen was a real person, someone who was willing to turn him into a vampire and was visiting him at night. He believed that she deserved respect, not mockery. So as he explained to the police, he became so angry that he lost control of himself. He claims this is when he grabbed a hammer, swung it around, and hit Thomas, his friend, with it. But Allan didn't stop there. He kept beating Thomas with the hammer over and over, a total of 10 hits. And by the time this assault was done, it was clear to Allan that Thomas was badly hurt and probably wouldn't survive. So that's when Allan also remembered what the Queen had said to him, that he could become a vampire if he murdered someone. So this is when Allan realized, oh, I've already done it. This is my opportunity. Rather than call an ambulance to try and help Thomas, again, all of this according to Allan, he decided to finish him off and become an immortal. Now, while Thomas was on the ground and unable to defend himself, Allan says he found 2 weapons, a kitchen knife and a Bowie knife. He used them to stab his best friend 42 more times. Allan even cut off some of Thomas's flesh and ate it. And then, after Thomas was dead, Allan knew what he needed to do next. He needed to drink Thomas's blood. He told the police that he believed he had consumed about 2 cups of it in total. And then he had to dispose of the body. Allan admitted to the investigators that Thomas was too big for him to carry. So instead, he lugged his friend's remains into a wheelbarrow and then he walked all the way to the woods where he dug the shallow grave. It's actually almost unbelievable that nobody saw Allan walking around with a dead body. But according to Allan's statement to the police, this worked. Clearly, it took about 6 weeks for anyone to find Thomas's remains, and nobody was able to connect Allan to the crime until then. And more importantly, at least in Allan's mind, he had achieved his goal. He actually tells police that he is a literal vampire now. He also said that the Queen had appeared to him more times after the murder, and you might hear that and think he was excited to keep seeing the Queen, but apparently he tells police he found her follow-up visits to be a little disappointing. He believed that he should be meeting more vampires now that he was one of them. He was in with the in crowd, except each time Queen came to visit him, she was still alone. And he couldn't understand why the other vampires were snubbing him. When he asked Aaliyah's fictional character about it, she told him that he needed to kill even more people. And Allan refused, and now there was apparently a bit of tension between him and his Queen friend. But the strangest thing was that Allan didn't seem at all bothered or upset by any of this. He seemed to recognize that it was unfortunate that Thomas, his friend, had died. However, he also seemed to believe that Thomas's murder was necessary for Allan's life. At one point, he even said, quote, "I'm going to get 20 to 25 for this, for doing him with a hammer and my Bowie knife, but I got his soul." There wasn't any emotion in his tone when he said this. He might as well have just been talking about the weather. And the police knew he was telling the truth because his description of the attack was completely consistent with the autopsy results. It was almost as if Allan really believed this vampire story. So, of course, Allan was charged with murder and with attempting to defeat the ends of justice. That second charge is the UK equivalent of what we might call tampering with evidence or obstruction of justice here in the US. The idea was that since he had buried Thomas's body, tossed his clothes in a bag, and tried to cover up his crime, Allan was, in fact, attempting to defeat the ends of justice. Now, after he consulted with a lawyer, he announced that he intended to go to court and claim that he wasn't mentally sound to stand trial. After all, if he is to be believed, he's clearly experiencing hallucinations that were interfering with his thinking, but that's not even the main point of his argument. According to Allan and his counsel, he hadn't actually committed the murders. They come up with this defense that Allan had given a false confession because it was hard for him to keep track of what was real and what wasn't. And on top of that, the police had allegedly manipulated him and gaslit him until he couldn't tell reality from fantasy about his friend Thomas. Now, supposedly, he now realized that 2 other men had killed Thomas, namely, they were Allan's father and a friend of the family. Apparently, Allan knew this because of a psychic message he had received. A voice in his head supposedly told Allan that his father and friend were plotting to murder him, but instead they had killed his friend Thomas and tried to frame Allan for the murder. Now, I know that this is like super ridiculous and honestly doesn't have much validity, It's hard to understand why Allan's lawyers even shared this unless they hoped it would prove that their client really was experiencing delusions. I'll note that in addition to making these statements, his attorney also put Allan in touch with mental health professionals, and they did diagnose him with a severe personality disorder. Apparently, his condition caused obsessive behavior, and the doctors thought that Allan's fascination with vampires was a result of this mental health condition, and they also said the disorder could have caused delusions. It seemed that he really genuinely believed the queen vampire was real. In fact, while Allan was staying at the mental health hospital, he told his doctors that the queen was still appearing to him and teaching him all about his new life as an immortal. But while Allan was working with his doctors and trying to claim insanity, the prosecutors in Scotland were building a case of their own. They learned that Thomas's murder was not Allan's first brush with violence. Apparently, when he was just 14 years old, Allan brought a knife with him to school and then he used it to stab a fellow student. Now, luckily, the victim pulled through and Allan ended up serving 3 years behind bars for this attack. Now, all appearances, he wasn't in a better mental state afterward. In fact, according to his friends, as an adult, Allan seemed to really enjoy violence and hurting people. He didn't care about others' pain. It was fun for him. He was weirdly also obsessed with Hitler. And on top of that, Thomas was very interested in true crime, especially one particular case that was in the news at the time. It was a murderer named Matthew Hardman. And this story might sound a little familiar. Matthew loved vampires. He wanted to become one. So he murdered a woman and drank her blood to try and become immortal. The crime had happened in 2001 and he was convicted in 2002. Meaning every time Allan turned on the TV in the months before he murdered Thomas, he saw stories about Matthew's crime. I think this just fed into delusion, might have served as inspiration. So to summarize, it's not like Allan had this amazing history and then really believed he needed to kill Thomas. Allan had a long history of violence. And on top of that, his doctors knew he was experiencing delusions and didn't seem to be thinking rationally. But the mental health professionals also didn't think he had been tricked or manipulated into giving a false confession. They thought he was grounded enough to know if he had murdered someone or not. It was just whether he believed it was the right thing to do. Plus, his mental profile fit the crime. It seemed like Allan was the sort of person who would kill Thomas and drink his blood to become a vampire. And on top of that, Allan still understood the difference between right and wrong. He'd still known it was illegal and immoral to kill Thomas. He tried to hide it. And that meant he did not meet the legal standard of his charges to be dismissed. So the courts threw out his plea and proceeded with a traditional trial. Now, during it, Allan still freely admitted to killing Thomas. He told the courts the same story he had told the police, that he was a vampire and his queen had transformed him after Thomas's murder. Except now he actually added a new detail. At this time, Allan claimed that he had multiple personalities and one was named Vamp. According to Allan, Vamp had also committed the murder. It wasn't him. It was his vampire persona. On top of that, Allan claimed that he didn't develop his split personality disorder until after he had watched the Queen of the Damned movie. Supposedly, the film was so upsetting it actually made him experience a break from reality, and Vamp showed up to handle it. Of course, Allan still isn't showing any remorse. He said it was because he didn't have anything to feel bad about. He said he didn't do anything wrong. The fault all lay with his alternate personality and maybe even the filmmakers who had made Queen of the Damned. Except, of course, there were plenty of mental health professionals to poke holes in this story. 3 separate psychiatrists testified against him. They all said that Allan committed the crime knowingly, willingly, and he was in control of his own choices. He could have not done it. It's probably no surprise to hear that he was convicted of the crime. In fact, the jury's decision was unanimous. Allan was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 18 years. Now, when the judge gave the sentence, he said it was because Allan was, quote, evil, violent, and highly dangerous. He figured Allan was too much of a threat to let him get out without a lengthy sentence, and the judge pointed at Allan's lack of remorse to support this ruling. Except at the end of the day, Allan served fewer than 2 years behind bars. Because just before 8 a.m. on Monday, November 15th, 2004, a guard went to Allan's cell to check on him, and that's when they found him dead. The preliminary investigation suggested that he had taken his own life. Now, it's hard to say what ultimately led to his suicide. Perhaps the guilt of what he had done to his best friend finally caught up with him, or maybe he realized he wasn't actually a vampire, and this truth just drove him to despair. It's possible he simply realized he didn't want to spend years or decades in prison. We will never know exactly what went through his mind during those final moments. I find it tragic that he wasn't able to get psychological help while he had been in prison. Allan was a killer, but it is clear that there were mental health issues at play in this case. Doesn't excuse it, just explains it. Now, that said, it is not surprising that he became so obsessed with creatures of the night. They fascinate and frighten all of us. And vampires are, of course, a big part of Halloween, which is why I'm covering this case this month. But as we dive into books, movies, TV shows, and other works of fiction, it is important to keep one thing in mind. Sometimes the things that go bump in the night are all too real. And that is the case of the Scotland vampire. Thank you guys so much for listening to today's episode, and I will see you next time with another one. Goodbye.